All right. So, welcome everyone. This is the best and worst fantasy trends talk as part of day 4 of TBRcon 2022. My name is Mihir Wanchoo of Fantasy Book Critic, and thanks to David Walters and the Fantasy Fee Addict team, I'm here to moderate this panel consisting of these lovely authors. And so, firstly, before I start, I want to reiterate my thanks again to David Walters and the rest of the team who have put together this fantastic program consisting of so many days with so many panels. All of the links can be found on our Twitter accounts as well as David's Twitter account. We'll be retweeting that throughout the day, as well as if you want to see repeats of these telecasts of these panels, you can find them on YouTube. So, without further ado, I would like the authors to go ahead and introduce themselves, beginning with you, Suzannah.
Thanks, Mihir. Well, I am Suzannah Rowntree. I'm from Australia. It's fairly early in the morning here. And I write historical fantasy. I'm probably best known for 2 series. One of them is the Watchers of Outremer series. The first book in that series was a Spiffbo finalist last year. And I just published the 4th book in that series this month. So, and that's a historical fantasy. Thank you. That's a historical fantasy set during the 200-year history of the Crusader states. It's a little bit timey-wimey and has like gin and magical weapons and eldritch dragon angels and all that sort of thing. And then I also write Gaslamp Monster Fantasy, which has been a pretty great hit for me this year. So that was exciting. And that's me.
All right. Well, thank you, Suzannah, and welcome. Steve, you're up next.
Hi, I'm Steve McHugh. I'm from the UK. I'm author of urban fantasy. I've written 13 books and 3 novellas over 3 series: the Hellion Chronicles, the Avalon Chronicles, and Rebellion Chronicles. And most recently, just end of last year, I published my first science fiction book, which was called Blackcoat. And yeah, I've been doing this full time now for some years, the number of which I can't remember off the top of my head.
Well, thank you, Steve. Yaroslav, I believe you're up next on my screen, so go ahead.
Sure. And I'm very humbled because, like everybody said, I'm the author of 13 books. I'm the author of 2 series. So I'm mostly known as the author of 1 novella, which was a Nebula finalist last year, called Tower of Mud and Straw, and also a number of short stories before that, but mostly the novella. So I don't have yet a lot of series under my belt or a lot of thick books under my belt, but I'm very, very humbled and honored to be in such a company.
Well, thank you, Yaroslav. Deston, you're up next, please.
Hello, I am Deston Munden. I am from North Carolina. I am currently the author of 2 book series, the Dargrass Chronicles, which currently has 2 books out, Tavern and Duke's Brand, and the Dust Orbit Blues series, which has 1 book coming out, it's already out, and 1 coming out this year. Dust Mountain Blues and Dust Ocean Blues. Dust Mountain Blues is currently a semi-finalist in the SPSFC, the SPFBO's sister competition, and yeah, I am also humbled by all the amazing people that's here.
All right. Well, firstly, I want to wish you best of luck for SPSFC, or Spacebo as we like to call it.
Yeah.
It's much easier that way. Wish you all the best, very best for your pathway ahead. It's going to be exciting. And lastly, Jeff, you're up next, please, sir.
Yeah. My name's Jeff G.R. Matthews. I am the author of 7 Deaths of an Empire, out from Rebellion in hardback last year and now in paperback in March. But I've also written other series when I've self-published. So I've got a set of books like With the Stone Road, which is set in ancient China, lots of kung fu and wuxia, and which are great. I love those. And a set of science fiction books set in the future but underwater. So sci-fi noir in the first person with a hero that gets beaten up a lot, which is quite good fun for me. And my accent will switch as I go through tonight from Hobbit of the Shire to Boris Johnson, as we noticed the other night, so it'll be fine.
Well, having read all of them, I can testify that they're really fun, and the hero does get beaten up a lot. But as the trope goes, he picks himself up and goes on to solve the mystery. Well, thank you so much, Jeff. All right, so we are here today to talk about the best and worst fantasy tropes. You're all writers. I'm pretty sure you have read a lot in the various genres and subgenres of fantasy and science fiction. So just want to begin out with this little simple thing. What are your favorite trends that you have seen in the genre of fantasy? And we'll talk about the worst ones a little bit later. But just what are some of the favorite trends, fantasy trends? And also, if you wish, you can give us an example of which books best exemplify those trends. Suzannah, you want to begin up with that first?
Sure. Well, when I was thinking about the answer to this question, I wound up with like 5 different trends that I can see that I've been enjoying, and so this is going to sound a little bit self-serving because it's very close to what I actually write. I'm sure none of the rest of you will. I'm sure none of the rest of you will fall into such a trap, but I'm just going to run with it. So one of the things that I really love to see is fantasy inspired by non-Western cultures. Like, The Lord of the Rings is my favorite book in the universe, but it is like when I read other fantasy, I tend to want to read fantasy that's inspired by Middle Eastern cultures or Asian cultures or Desi or African or South American fantasy worlds that draw on those different cultures. And I see so much more of that happening than there used to be. And it's just so imaginatively satisfying to me. I love it. Very much related, I really love historical fantasy, which is, magical events happening in real world history, because I'm a real world history buff. I've always loved history. When I first started reading fantasy, I read The Lord of the Rings. It became my favorite book, and I'm like, okay, I love fantasy. And then I would read secondary world fantasy, and for some reason it didn't appeal to me as much. But then I would read like historical stuff written throughout history, Beowulf, or the Norse mythology and the Poetic Edda, or Homer. All those epics written in the ancient medieval worlds. All of those books were set in our world, but with fantastical elements. And that was what I really loved. And so that's something that I'm excited to see becoming a trend in fantasy these days, is historical fantasy. Stuff like The City of Brass by Shannon Chakraborty, or The Bear and the Nightingale, or Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell. I just really enjoy that. Then a couple of others, I'll try not rattle on too long. One of the trends that I've seen recently, just in recent years, is a lot of female-led fantasy and fantasy with romantic elements that's crossing over from like kind of the young adult ghetto where it's been stuck for a long time, crossing over into adult fantasy, stuff like A Deadly Education and Naomi Novik's other stuff, Tasha Suri's stuff, Empire of Sand. We're seeing like adult fantasy novelists writing great female-led fantasy and taking it seriously. I really love to see that. And somewhat related, I really love seeing more older female protagonists, like middle-aged female protagonists, mothers having adventures, or even just on a broader level, more protagonists who are happily married, whether they're male or female. And, like it's been very traditional in the hero's journey model to have a protagonist who's quite isolated from community. And I'm really enjoying seeing a lot more protagonists who are in community, in family, have, spouses and children and all that kind of thing. So those are some of my favorite trends that I've seen.
Well, thank you. We will definitely be talking more, because I have some, the things that you mentioned, like The Deadly Education, The City of Brass, The Bear and Nightingale. I really love those books as well. So we'll definitely be talking more about that. Steve, what about you? Any thoughts about some of the things that you love in amongst fantasy trends?
Like Suzannah said, I really like historical fantasy. I like that a lot. I think even going back to stuff like Terry Pratchett, some of that stuff is based on historical stuff that he's just twisted and things. and I enjoyed that. I've always enjoyed that. And I think there's probably more. Not even the comedy side, just having it based on, and the fact that there's now more diverse writers and more diverse authors that bringing in more history from places that aren't just the same historical settings over and over again, churning out the same thing is great, and that's happening a lot more over the last few years, and it continues to happen. And I hope it gets more and more and more. I think the more diverse authors we have, the better everybody else becomes, because there's more out there for everybody to read, and everyone has to up their game to try and keep up with everybody else. The other thing I'm enjoying, again, like Suzannah, is female-led fantasy. There's a lot of it, and not just female-led fantasy, but also black main characters, LGBT main characters, and the like. I think as someone who is a straight white guy, I enjoy reading about people who aren't me, who aren't like me, who I can look at and say, that's really cool. That's a completely different type of character. So yeah, that's my trend that I'm seeing that I really like. Just diversity in fiction in general, really.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Steve. We can all agree that diversity, especially in thought and in fiction, is always appreciated and is always welcome, since the diversity in readers is visibly seen. Yaroslac, what would you say are your favorite trends in fantasy?
Yeah, I mean, I completely agree with the older leads, especially older female leads. A friend of mine, Sylvia Wrigley, published a book called Throw Grandma Out of the Airlock, which is basically an exploration of the older female characters in fiction, in science fiction and fantasy, and we don't have enough of them. We don't get enough of them. And it's so much more interesting, so much more complex than having a protagonist who is doing coming of age, because there's only as much as you can write with coming of age. Although, of course, if you look at Dune, it's coming of age. If you look at Lord of the Rings, it's also kind of coming of age. Harry Potter is coming of age. Game of Thrones is coming of age. But I mean, it's more interesting to look at different age groups and different characters. The second thing I really enjoy is seeing Russia. Being a Russian is seeing Russia in fiction, We need more of that. I mean, of course, it can be, the Third World War can break out very soon. So after that, it will be very difficult to see Russian fiction. But if we'll survive that, past that point, I would love to see more Russian fantasy. We have Grishaverse, for example, right? Shadow and Bone trilogy. We have a version of Russia in my novella and in my upcoming novel. So that's a small advertisement, right, on the side. That'd be cool. That'd be cool. Another trend which I'm seeing actually is present more in the short fiction than in the longer fiction. If you look at the magazines like Uncanny, they publish a lot of quite weird fantasy, and I think the fantasy has a great potential for poetry, incredible potential for poetry. Because in poetry, when you write a poem, you can write, okay, I woke up in the morning and a flower bloomed out of my diaphragm, right? And everybody will be fine with that, because everybody understands when you're reading a poem, you shouldn't take things literally at face value, right? So it's a metaphor. But if you write this in prose, in a novel, then people will be like, okay, what's going on? Is the hero drugged? Is it a dream or something? So you need to explain, actually, okay, it felt as if, and so on. And as soon as you write this, it felt as if, of course, the magic is gone, the metaphor loses its potency, and it's useless. And you can't do those things in mainstream. You can't write the flower bloomed out of my diaphragm in mainstream. You can't write it in science fiction, but you can write it in fantasy, because in fantasy, technically, you can get away with anything. You can have anything. Flowers blooming off people, people coming out of the ground, living in the sea, and so on. And this gives a great potential for having metaphors embedded directly into the narrative. And this is what some of the short story writers today are doing. And again, I've quoted Uncanny, because if you look at this magazine, like every second story there is like that. and I would love to see more fantasy that explores it. But of course, again, it's easier to do in a short story, and whenever we're doing a novel or a longer work, of course, we need to fall back on more traditional devices to keep the reader engaged throughout. You can't just keep throwing weird stuff at the reader. It's not the 70s, and nobody is doing drugs while reading the novels, you know. So you can only do as much with that. But I would love to see that in certain proportion.
Perfect. Well, thank you. And I'm just going to borrow one of Suzannah's favorites to recommend to you if you haven't already read it, The Bear and the Nightingale. Russian-inspired, amazing trilogy. It's
Cool.
finished by Catherine Arden. Just love it. That's the only, and it actually takes Russian folklore and then merges it with like actual history, if I'm not wrong, historical era. I'm not really too sure of that, but it's amazing. If you haven't read it, I would love for you to give it a try, and of course with Suzannah's recommendation as well.
Thank you so much for the tip.
All right. So thank you for that. Deston, you're up next, sir.
All right. Some of my favorite trends tend to be like large epic fantasies, like Brandon Sanderson. All his books are like gigantic. I can read 1,000 pages from him. I also like very humorous fantasies, like The Kings of the Wild by Nicholas Amos. It's a very fun story about older men doing things and kind of like living back their like their younger days, and that just always spoke well with me because I'm like, that's interesting. I like that. Historical based fantasy. When like Suzannah mentioned she wrote it, my eyes lit up. So that was like, that's my jam. I also like really classic high fantasy, and I feel like it's kind of disappearing, and it makes me kind of sad. Where like you see a lot of magical races, and that is like the fantasy that I'll write, with like orcs, elves, golems, etc. Like there's no human races in my fantasy. Not like strictly human races, but like, and I wanted to kind of like explore those things of having like a world that's just basically all magic. Everyone has it. It's completely magical. And one other trend that I've seen be getting really popular is lit RPG fantasy. It's been getting really popular, and I enjoy it a lot. Like, one of my favorite ones is actually Korean, called Solo Leveling. It has amazing artwork. It's a graphic novel, and it just finished up. I would suggest anyone that wants to get into that like leveling style fantasy to read that first, because it's such a good way to get into that like style. Also, Will Wright, if you haven't like read any of his books, that's a good way to start too. But yeah, those are like some of my favorite trends that I've been following. I think that's it.
All right. Well, perfect. Definitely have heard of Will White. Him and the Cradle series. I know many bloggers have like started reading or already have read him, and he's huge. Like he's one of the most popular authors that almost outside of his domain nobody has heard of. But he's super, super, super popular. Sells a lot, and is also a fantastical guy. I've seen him in a couple of interviews. Just down to earth and humble, and really amazing as well.
Yeah.
Well, thank you for that, sir. Yep.
I'm sorry to interrupt. I'm just reading the comments in the background, and VR Ginjal writes, I'm 35 this year, and I feel like I'm just now coming of age. And I just wanted to say I feel you, you know.
Oh, yeah, like,
I feel you totally. Sorry.
No, not at all, Yaroslav. That is true. 35 coming of age.
I'm hitting 50 this year. I think I'm coming of age now. 35.
Well, that is good for you, sir. And why don't you talk about your favorite fantasy trends then, Jeff?
Oh, mine. Well, I've gone last, so everyone's stolen my great ideas, obviously. But I think that there is what we see a lot more of, and I really love, is taking other cultures into fantasy. That certainly, from my perspective, the books that I get out there and read now, it's much easier to find, and you can explore different cultures in different books, and they can tell you about it, and they're writing from places of knowledge, and I love that because I'm a geographer as well as a writer, and just finding about different parts of the world, even if it's a secondary world, even if it's a world you've created, there's stuff in it that comes from our cultures and our histories that just, you enable you to see things differently. have a different perspective on life and on the way that fantasy works, because you go back in time far enough. I remember the 70s, I was there. So the fantasy I started reading probably in the 80s was all the same. I loved Dragonlance, brilliant. I love Belgariad. I love all those kind of old epic fantasies that existed. And they're still going strong. Sanderson still writes loads of those. But we are, and as Deston said, the orcs are appearing less now. You don't get that high magic anymore. And it's almost like there's an obfuscation of magic. It's not as clear cut. The rules aren't there all the time anymore as they used to be in some books. But I quite like that as well, because it becomes a bit more of an organic thing. So apart from what everybody else said, that's mine.
Well, thank you for that. And yes, it like the high fantasy of the 80s and 70s is definitely disappearing. I think it began disappearing from the early 90s when epic fantasy with like the Robert Jordan, George R. R. Martin kind of started ascending. It slowly started disappearing. And the closest I can think of is the Grey Bastard series by Jonathan French. Even though it has like a lot of humanoid races, it's on the lower fantasy side. It is not the classical high fantasy. I can only think of Nicholas Eames off the top of my head, who still has that, even though it's like a fun-based comedic fantasy, it still includes a lot of non-human races and has that magic quotient as well.
Yeah, and through his, there are lots of nods towards the fact that it is high fantasy, that there's that world.
Mm-hmm.
I now cannot remember the book that was in SPFBO that I read as a judge a while ago, which did the same thing, and I should remember it. Son of a Lich is the second one. Can't remember the first one. It's really bad of me. Should look that up. But it takes that idea of high fantasy and twists it into the economy being based on the orcs and the treasure and all those. I really
not Orconomics.
Yes, that's the one.
Orconomics, yeah.
I love that. That was
I really love Orconomics.
Really, really good.
That was the fourth edition, and it won that edition as well.
I dipped out for a year and a bit now, haven't I? So I can't keep track of all those anymore. But yeah, really good.
Zachary, yep, Orconomics was fun. It kind of combined everything, and it was a satire. It was really brilliantly done as well. So, thank you all for sharing that. One thing you all kind of have hinted on, or at least pointed towards, that you all mostly love historical-based fantasy, as well as you want to see different perspectives, or in the sense of like different types of fantasy that is being explored or that has been written so far. Mainly from a non-Western perspective. Suzannah definitely mentioned like the Middle Eastern, East Asian, Desi perspectives. Steve, you kind of mentioned the fact that you definitely want to see different writers of different backgrounds coming in and writing their own story in a way, or co-opting other cultures. One thing which I do want to hear from you all is, while you can definitely think of it as like you wanted to write, but besides that, what specific culture from a specific region or geography would you like to see, or even from like a certain historical time point or mythological time point, would you like to see being written, write yourself, or hope that it comes about in the near future? And should I pick, or does anyone want to go first?
Do we jump in?
Oh, please.
Yaroslac, you go.
No. I mean, I just wanted to say I think I've already kind of answered that question. Yeah. I would like to see more Slavic cultures. Yeah, but Steve, by all means, please go.
Oh, thanks.
Oh, sorry.
Okay.
Yeah, it was you. I'm sorry. I was totally confused.
It's late at night for us in Europe. We know.
I'm from South Yorkshire. There's not really an awful lot of South Yorkshire fantasy. That's not really a thing.
A lot of crime novels.
Yeah. There's a lot of really dark, gritty thrillers about horrible things happening to people, and not an awful lot of books about the magic of the Yorkshire Dales and hunting for orcs and fairies. It's not a thing.
That's all my part. That's all my part of England, isn't it?
This is also self-serving, so I apologise for that. I actually wrote one of my books that's set in Doncaster, and I blew up a big chunk of it. And I was fun. I was writing in my own sort of place that I grew up. So no, there's not a lot of that. I tell you what, if anyone can write a really good epic fantasy and base it entirely on Yorkshire history, I would read the hell out of that. That would be the most bizarre book in history ever, because Yorkshire is bonkers.
Just make a note, South Yorkshire.
Yeah, to be an expert.
All right. Yorkshire-based fantasy for Steve.
Yorkshire-based fantasy, yeah. Pure epic.
I would love to see that too. I would totally read that.
So we have one Russian-based fantasy request. We have one Yorkshire-based fantasy request. Suzannah, what about you? What do you think?
Look, I often find myself looking for more Slavic fantasy, so that's one. But I would love to see someone write like a high or epic fantasy based on Australian Aboriginal stuff.
Wow, yeah.
Like this is something that I can't do myself, especially not at this point in time. I'm not sure that I should do it myself, but I would love to see it. Another thing that I really want to see, and I really want to I'm fascinated by medieval African civilizations. I would love to see more stuff. I mean, I slung a medieval Nubian character into one of my books because that was a thing during one of the time periods that I'm working in. But yeah, I mean, it's just so hard to find good information on that time and place, and I don't know, I want to see that. Somebody write me a medieval African fantasy.
All right. Well, thank you. I might have a recommendation for you on the Aboriginal fantasy. We recently, a long time ago, we at Fantasy Book Critic had reviewed an Australian author called David Hare, and I believe he had written a series based on Aboriginal myths beforehand. So I might have to recall my memory, but I believe so because I interviewed him and I think he mentioned that. So I will get back to you on that. Slavic fantasy. Okay, so 2 requests for Slavic fantasy. All right, Deston, you're up next, sir. What would you like to see more of, and which region? Or
I actually enjoy a lot of like Chinese fantasies, and I also like I would love to see something based off the Yoruba like mythology, because there's so much things you can do with the Yoruba like African mythology.
Absolutely.
That you can like mess with. On a really weird request, I would like some Southern like American fantasies, because that's where I live and I like to see it. So I've written a kind of like a Southern American sci-fi, but I've never seen someone take like the Southern culture and apply it to fantasy in the way that like I would have wanted. Because it would be like kind of negative. Like a lot of it, like when they like go to a fantasy place in like in our world, and it's based on the Southern culture, it's instantly negative. Everyone's racist. Like, and I was like, that's not how it is all the time. So I would like to see more of that, like see more in a positive light rather than like this negative light that they can just like put it in all the time.
I like that you added all the time. I like that. All right, Jeff, you, sir, are last for this question.
Again, you're taking all my ideas again. No, you haven't. But I love Chinese fantasy. Really, I grew up watching kung fu movies of all descriptions, including ghost stories and things, and zombies that jump and don't walk. They're in one of my series. That kind of thing. It's just because for me, how I grew up near a farm in the middle of a field, it's completely different. And that's what I loved about it. And that's why I wrote my first series was based in China, in ancient China. That kind of history is just fantastic. And it's just so different. You know, the fact that they had emperors based on moral merit where they began rather than power, which is just, so different. But for my own Roman fantasy, I don't know who wrote that, but someone should definitely write books with Romans in it somewhere. That's different as well. But you and me, you've read one of the books that will probably never see the light of day that I wrote, which was basically a journey from where Steve lives in Southampton, up past Devizes and Swindon, where I come from, to Cheltenham, GCHQ, as a sci-fi kind of cross with fantasy horror. So I've done that, Steve. I've done my area. But I love the fact that different cultures, so definitely Chinese. I've got the second book from Jin Yang upstairs. I need to read that. But anything around there, it's just so far away from where I come from. It just makes a difference.
Well, thank you for sharing that. East Asian fantasy is definitely, I feel like there's, even on the indie side as well as on our, the traditional publisher side, the publishers are actually discovering that East Asian fantasy, be it Korean inspired, Japanese inspired, Chinese inspired, or even the Southeast Asian nations as well. It's kind of seems to be on the upswing, which is like a huge plus.
Yeah.
And I'm speaking as a South Asian. I love East Asian, inspired fantasy books. There was a dearth of them. They seem to be coming up. Sword of Kaigan won the SPFPO just a couple of years ago. Never Die by Rob J. Hayes was also, I believe, a finalist. And I think, well, of course, everybody knows of R.F. Kuang and her fantastic, trilogy, which I think is now going to be also be published by Subterranean Press, with the special edition and everything. So yeah, that'll be a huge plus. And this is just my sincere request to all you writers and everybody who's listening in. As an Indian, I happen to love the epic of Mahabharata. I don't know if you all know about it or not, but it is the longest running epic in the world. And I, for one, would love for any author to just write a fantastic fantasy series based on it, because it's so rich with characters, it's rich with gray situations and magic, and it has everything, even space for some reason. But I would love for somebody to explore that, and that's been my one hope, that before I die, many decades in the future, I at least get to read somebody writing about the Mahabharata in a fantastical version, or at least like an epic fantasy version of it. All right. Well, thank you all for sharing that. So talking about, since we have talked about so far about like what you all like and what you would like to, what you want to see from the upcoming fantasy trends, one question is the counter of it. What do you currently dislike about the current fantasy trends that you have seen so far or in the past decade? And in this case, I'm just going to switch it around. So Jeff, you got to go first.
To be fair, there's not a lot I dislike. I dislike bits with objectification of women and rape stuff that goes in books. It's pointless. I don't see why that's in there. Other than that, I tend to read stuff that I'm going to like, which is a really weird way of putting it, isn't it? But if there's a bit in that book, I read the blurb of it, I read a couple of pages of it, and I go, it's really, I don't like this bit. I don't pick it up and read it. So there's not a ton out there that I just go, this isn't going to work, because generally most things do. I was there with agents talking a little while ago, or something came out about the next trend in fantasy is joy fantasy. Everything's going to be happy, golden unicorns, everybody dancing around and saying, woohoo, I'm happy, look at me. Don't check it, Steve, it's great, you'll write that, you'll love it. In South Yorkshire, it'll go really well.
Originated.
Yeah, exactly.
All the time.
But I think that if that came to pass, that might be something that I might avoid. Is not the South Yorkshire one, I would love that. But the idea of joy, that fantasy is all joy, because you need conflict, you need danger, you need
suffering,
death, suffering, yeah,
a lot of it.
To the edge, it has to be there. Otherwise, it doesn't really click for me, at least. And I say the objectification of women. If you've read Sammy H.K. Smith's book Anna, brilliant. That deals with abuse, but does it from a place of knowledge. In fact, that from her job, and it is absolutely a powerful read. I know Peter McLean thinks the same. To read it as well. Absolutely fantastic. If you can get into that.
Fair enough. I have heard of that, and that is something of a particular thing. If you noted, it doesn't matter the genre, even if it's thriller and mystery, as well as with on the fantasy side, British writers in general, they tend to dwell a lot on the dark depths of the human mind. That is just something. I don't know why, because I read a lot of mystery and thriller stuff as well, but the British writers take it to a whole different level. I mean, American writers and other writers of other nationalities, they do write fantastic books, but as a general whole, and I don't know if you have read Mo Hader, she unfortunately passed away just a few months ago. She is by far the most terrifying writer I have ever read. And I mean that in all, in as a respect of how good her books were, but she had the ability to write about simplistical things and still terrify you. And I haven't found that in amongst any other writer, be they writing grimdark or horror or anything else. And she used to just write regular mystery thrillers. So I don't know why. All right, well, Deston, sir, what do you not like about the current fantasy trends, or which trends do you not? They don't touch about.
I am not a huge fan of grimdark. I feel like a lot of the time it gets so grimdark that it gets depressing. Like most of the time, like when I read a grimdark book, I'm like, can they be happy for 1 second? And it's like, please, can I laugh for 1 second without someone dying a horrible death? And I'm like, that kind of fantasy just doesn't like resonate with me. I'm not a huge fan of when another trend I don't really like when they stuff a romance in a book when it doesn't need to be there. I've seen a lot of people that's like quarreling, and they'd be like, "Oh, why did this person and this man and this woman didn't get together?" And I'm like, "Can they just be friends? Like, is that possible? Like, I think we can work a like middle ground here. Like, they're like a man and a woman can be friends. I promise."
You're singing my song, Deston, but not only that, but I think a lot of people are trying to write romance without actually knowing how.
Yeah.
And so they do a terrible job of it. Like, they don't know how to do it, but they think that they've got to put one in, and then they're like, well, I don't really like romance, but I think this, anyway.
They don't know how to do it in real life or in fiction.
I don't know. I can only judge their fiction. I can't try to judge their real life.
Probably the British authors because they're all repressed and can't deal with it.
I see a lot of agents be like,
stoic.
add a romance to it. And I'm like, no, don't tell your authors to add a romance to it if it's not in their like story. And like, if that's the case, don't go to that agent because they're looking for something that's not in your book. And lastly, dystopian fiction right now. I just don't need that in my life. Like, I just don't. I'm an American right now. I just don't need that in my life. Like, maybe later in my life, just I'll live that every day. So that's my trend that I'm kind of avoid right now.
I think we can all agree that grimdark and dystopian fiction, I think we would all like to put it in our back mirrors and just want to go away, far away, especially after 2020 and the ongoing pandemic.
I think I'm good for right now.
I don't know. There's that point, and maybe it's because I'm British, because we're British. But, you know, when the plague came and we went into lockdown, a friend I was working with recommended I start watching all the plague films. I'm watching Contagion and stuff. It's great. And, you know, I'm watching those. It's just, you know, we do tend to wallow in these things.
We are very good at wallowing.
We are. It's our national skill. It really is.
We're also
if we
warriors.
If we were D&D characters, we'd have specialities in wallowing. +5. +5 sword of wallowing.
And booze. We're very good at that.
Oh, yeah.
That doesn't necessarily go very well with the other things.
Maybe one leads to the other, right?
Yeah, usually.
All right, fair. Yaroslav, would you like to go next about the trends that you like to see disappear for eternity?
Sure. Like, I'm all for a little bit more joy in fiction in general, of course, but the problem here is, Mihir, you said dark depths of human mind. The problem is I don't think there are any bright depths in human minds. So if you really drill down, there's only darkness inside, which kind of 2020 and 2021 really showed us. Also, it's a funny thing. It doesn't have much to do with the current topic, but before the pandemic, like 2 years before, I wrote a novella, which I thankfully didn't publish, about a magical plague, which has the city of Vienna, where I currently live, walled up, and people are socially distancing, and all that. Then, before this whole situation with Ukraine, I wrote the Tower of Monstreux novella, which has this will they attack or won't they attack component in it. And so I'm outlining the next novel, and there's war in it. So I'm like, I'm having second thoughts about that storyline. Really, I mean, maybe I shouldn't write that. But anyway, about the trends which I really wish would disappear. I'm going to go kind of against the current here. The trend which I really dislike, and I understand why it exists. I understand why people really dig it. I'm not getting any positive reaction here probably, but I would really like to have less books which are like huge mastodon 900 pagers, because I understand why it exists. I really do, because I always say that fantasy writers especially are unhappy people writing books for other unhappy people. No, I'll explain why. Look, the thing here is, like, if you're, fantasy is all about escapism, right? Science fiction, they have like they toy with the future and they have dystopian societies and so on. But fantasy is really pure, as close as you can get to pure escapism, right? And let's say if you're driving a Ferrari somewhere in California, I mean, you're really ripped, like six-pack, or really beautiful. If you're a woman, and you're like a senior executive on the rise, you're partying hard, just going for a swim every day. Like, why would you want escapism? What would you want to escape from, really? So escapism kind of, for me, presumes that there is some component of life, some magic component, which people feel at odds with. And God knows I have it. So, of course, I mean, if there is more escapism in a book, if the book is thicker, then it's better for that purpose. But as a writer, whenever I go into a brick and mortar bookstore and I see a 900-pager on the bookshelf, I look at it as man, unless you're Leo Tolstoy, there's no way all of those 900 pages are good. Just statistically. I mean, maybe like 300 pages are absolutely brilliant, out of this world, but it just can't be that all 900 are good. And I really miss the times like the 70s, not the drugs, but I really miss the fact that we could have really slim novels, and those slim novels could be sold and could actually do very fine. Because I recently compared the word counts. I don't know if you know it, Roger Zelazny had a novella called He Who Shapes. And novella, I think it was like 30,000 words. And then he expanded it into a novel called The Dream Master. And the novel was 43,000 words long. And it's one of the like standout novels in the fantasy science fiction genre. But it was really thin, and you could publish a thin book back then, and nobody would likely say, "Oh my gosh, like what are you doing? Are you really a novelist or something? Come on, man, write more." And there was also, I'm sorry for rambling. There was also one, I don't remember who, on Twitter recently. And that guy posted a review from Goodreads. It was a good review. And the person said, I mean, how can it be that this book is so good and so short? And the punchline was that the book was actually 130K. So it was quite big. I mean, if you put together all of my writing I've done in my life, you probably won't get to 130K. But in today's landscape, it's considered a slim fantasy book. So I wouldn't want the 900 pages to go. Let them be. I just want to kind of see more of the slim books, and maybe we'll have that because we have now paper shortage. We have problems with deliveries, So maybe we'll return into that. I don't know.
As a blogger, I thoroughly agree with you about wanting lesser, smaller books because, concise fantasy can still be great. Having to read 10 massive door-stoppers in the SPFPO finals, while it's fun, can get exhausting after a while. And also, I would love for you to talk to George R.R. Martin so he can maybe slim down on his novels and maybe get closer to finishing off his fantasy series.
Yeah, that's another pitfall, because if you're writing 900 pages, I mean, you have to wrestle with a lot of storylines, and you can't just have the same characters in every book. You have to introduce new characters, right? So now I have like I imagine that, I don't know how George Martin lives, man, but I imagine he has like
in a fancy house, in a real fancy house,
yeah. Like with pink fountains in every room or something. But I imagine he has whole walls, just like he looks at them like a crazy guy. There are just all the storylines, all the characters, drawn on them. I mean, I can't possibly imagine how he can wrestle all of those storylines and all of those characters. It's too much.
It is. I had read in an interview that he had described it as in the middle of the series, he said the largest, in measure of his timeline and characters, and he's trying to weed them down. But apparently there's so much of a plot issue that he can't just indiscriminately kill them off because his future plot lines will be affected. And now that's one of the major reasons why he's 10 years behind from publishing the sixth book. Yeah. That's what I'd read, so I could be wrong. Also, this is just a side issue, but I would disagree, and all the narcotic trade of the 1980s would disagree with you about why successful people were having existential crisis. The amount of cocaine that they consumed, as Narcos season 1, 2, and 3, and Narcos Mexico season 1, 2, and 3 would have you believe that it didn't matter how rich you were, it didn't matter how happy you were. They needed the cocaine for something. There's something inside that they couldn't reach, which apparently cocaine helped them reach or helped them fulfill. So I would disagree a little bit on that with you, Yaroslav.
They probably ban this broadcast. Like, okay, there's too much drugs in that.
Yeah, we're not promoting anything. I'm just saying, based on what Narcos and the books I've read,
I agree.
Tends to say that, no matter how rich or poor, cocaine is the way to go. Okay, I'm not saying it. I haven't.
None of us are saying that, Anna. As a legal disclaimer, none of us here believe that as a way of life, and would definitely stand against it if we need to in any court of law right now. Move on.
All right, moving on. I believe, Steve, you're next, sir.
Okay. I don't have any real current trends that I dislike because, like Jeff, if I don't like something, I don't read it. There are 3 things that I dislike in not just fantasy but in writing in general. The first one is the farm boy girl chosen one. The last person who did it well is John Gwynne. And by the last person, I mean ever. I don't think I've ever read a book of the chosen one that was as good as that ever. And I'm not a fan of. If I never read another one, I'll be quite happy, and I don't really care. The second thing I hate, love triangles. I just don't like them. They're just boring. There was a spate of them in in the YA especially with in the early 2000s, just loads of love triangles everywhere. Will she pick this really sexy dude, or will she pick this really sexy dude? I don't care. Just kill them all. Move on. I couldn't have cared less by any. And I know some people will love the love triangles, and they'll be either one camp or the other, and fair play to you. Well done. But
honestly, mate, I don't think many people like them. Actually, it's just that there was a big publishing hit with one, and then everybody was like, you have to put one in your book so that it sells. And
I'm like, just choose both of them. I don't care.
And and the last one, has already been mentioned, but I completely agree with him, and that's huge books. I don't have time to read 900-page novels on a regular basis. I just don't. The largest book I ever wrote was 150,000 words, and that was about 600 pages. And I don't have time to read. And I'm sure that they are great books, and I've read a couple of these 900-page, 1,000-page plus books, and they are very good. But they're also really good weapons, and I don't need more weapons in the house. I don't need anything that could be used to bludgeon people when they come in the door on my bookshelf. As soon as I pick it up, and when the thing that gives it away is you'll pick it up and the first page will say prologue 1. I like a prologue. I love a prologue. Most of my books have prologues in them. I don't need 6 of the bloody things before we start the book. 70 pages of prologue is a bit too much prologue. You're writing a D&D campaign now, and you should publish it as its own thing. I'm not a fan of that. I kind of went on a rant then, but I didn't really need to. The never-ending beginning of 950-page books. They can go away, never come back, and I'll be quite happy.
And by the way, again, sorry for interrupting. I just wanted to, Steve, when you said that about the never-ending beginnings, it was a shock to me. But maybe even somebody from Fantasy Book Critic on Twitter, they posted a poll, which basically posed a question to the readers: do you read prologues? And
yes,
and it was 50-50. 50% of people said no, I don't. And like the authors, there were a couple of authors in the thread, and I was like, okay, but I mean, isn't it part of the book? Like, why wouldn't you read that? But the reason is exactly that what you said, right? So if it's just it's a never-ending beginning something which has little to do at least at first with the main narrative, of course you would want to skip that.
Yeah, I every prologue I've ever written has always been really tightly interwoven with the main story, and I've always made sure of it. So if you didn't read the prologue, good luck. So, but and I've always done that. If I've written a prologue, it's because it needs to be there. But there are a lot of prologues in a lot of books which are either far too long and could just be a chapter, or don't need to be there in the first place because it's either massive exposition, which you could break up and put in the story. You don't need to have 50 pages of info dump at the beginning of your book. Because I would normally give a book 50 pages and then be like, you know what, this isn't for me. And if your first 50 pages are 500 years ago in the castle of a young boy who was sweeping a rug.
He's not very good at his job, is he? Sweeping it.
He's not. He's rubbish at it.
He'd be the hero. He's all right.
But I won't get there.
You're twisting the farm boy trope now into servant boy trope. And he'll
yeah. Somehow that just reminds me of the Dragon Ball chair. Like
prologues that are like just never ending. Yeah, they can do that.
While I definitely hear you in the prologues, I as a reader love to read them.
I love prologues, just not
too many of them.
Irrelevant.
Not too many of them. You're right, of course.
I can't remember what. I'm pretty sure I kind of think I'm trying to remember which book had that, like multiple prologues, like prologue 1, prologue 2, prologue 3. I cannot remember the top of it, but I have read a book like that. I don't know if Brandon. I haven't really read a lot of Brandon Sanderson in the recent past. Has anybody?
Deston, he does do that sometimes,
right?
He has done that, yeah. But he
doesn't.
I
like his books, but I'm like, I'm pretty sure we don't need all of these prologues.
He'll call it a prelude. And then a prologue. No, man, that's not. You're not putting the wall over my eyes. That's just 2 prologues.
I believe in his Stormlight archives, it's kind of like that. Like there's the same prologue occurring in each and every book, but you get to see it from a different person's perspective. But also, it's like there's preludes in between, and
yeah.
And then he has interludes, and I'm like, okay, we need to cut some of this down.
All right. Well, thank you for sharing that, Steve. Suzannah, anything from you?
Sure. Look, at the top of my list, I've got overlong books. But I'm actually beginning to reconsider that stance since Steve pointed out that they can be used as bludgeons. And I can always use more bludgeons around the house. But I think I won't use books. Like, there are heavier things. Again, like Yara said, if you want to monopolize my attention for more than 150,000 words, you better be flaming Tolkien. Like, can we please just have some short fantasy novels that are good and short and get the job done? Because they exist, and they often exist in like urban fantasy or fantasy for younger people these days. If you want to read a shorter fantasy, that's where you got to go. I read a great fantasy, a historical fantasy actually, about the Bronte siblings called Worlds of Ink and Shadow last year, and I really enjoyed it. But one of the things that just blew my mind was that it had like 4 or 5 main characters, point of view characters, and each of them had a satisfying character arc. And she got that job done in like 73,000 words. It was amazing. It was wonderful. Anyway, another thing that I tend to avoid is hard magic, and I know that this is not something that a lot of people agree with me on, but if I want to get like super analytical and scientific about something, I would much rather read some actual hard science fiction, and that way I'll learn something that will actually be useful or interesting to me in the real world. And when I go to fantasy, I often go to fantasy more for the philosophical and metaphorical discussions of real life issues. And so I find that soft magic fits better with that kind of thing than hard magic does. So that's one of my preferences. Again, I'm also I also tend to avoid the super grimdark stuff, and this may come as somewhat of a surprise to my readers, especially the ones who've read my most recent book. Like, okay, I'm writing historical fantasy set during the Crusades, right? And it's very historically accurate, as historically accurate as I can make it. And that means a lot of terrible things happen on the regular in my books. But I also like to write the more fun stuff where I actually bend the history to make it a bit more feel good. And I think people need both these things. Like a couple of years ago, I was going through a really hard time. I had a family member in hospital and I was feeling quite anxious. I couldn't read the usual stuff that I enjoy, the kind of darker, spikier stuff. I had to just like binge read a whole bunch of fluffy fairy tale retellings that were just sweet and uncomplicated and helped me take my mind off my worries. And I think a lot more people are needing that these days. At worst, grimdark can be quite nihilistic. And even if it's not that, like I totally respect a lot of my friends who write grimdark, and I understand it myself. Like I like to see my characters being broken down and having to learn hard lessons. But I often have a problem with grimdark fantasy world building. And again, I'm a student of history. I'm constantly reading up on the medieval Crusades. And I actually often find grimdark fantasy to be rather unrealistic from a world building perspective when it comes to how exploitative the world is and how violent. And I mean, even the worst real world regimes you can think of have to give their people some form of normality so that they can actually survive to be exploited. So I just find it unrealistic sometimes. And then the final thing that I had on my list is kind of related, which is I really do not appreciate any flippant use of sexual violence or rape. You see it used all the time to motivate a character or toughen up a character. You see it used as like set dressing for the world. This is how awful the world is. It's super rapey. No, thank you. I don't want to read about that. You see it used to motivate a male character. Oh, this happened to someone I care about. Well, I don't want to see women's suffering being used as an engine for somebody, a man's development and motivate. I don't want to see that. Sexual assault victims, whether in fiction or in real life, deserve to be treated with dignity and respect. And if an author is going to go there at all, it should be done with great care. Like personally, it is something that I intend to write about eventually, but I'm just not even going to touch on it unless I can devote the time and attention that such a big topic and such an often misunderstood topic deserves. And I want to shout out to my friend Intisar Kanani. Her book Thorn really does this so well. Like one of the things I really appreciate about how her book tackles the topic of sexual violence is that it doesn't show the event. It deals entirely with the aftermath. And I think that's something that, like, there's been this, I'm not really on Twitter, there's been a lot of talk among film critics about the recent film, The Last Duel. And like, I totally lost interest in seeing that, even though it was about a case that I knew about from my medieval history studies. I totally lost interest in seeing it when I realized that they were going to portray the rape on screen. And not merely once, but multiple times. Like, I don't need that. You can make a story about this woman and what she went through and how she was brave without having to like re-traumatize viewers.
Yeah.
Okay. So like those are my thoughts on that. I really don't want to see that trend anymore. I want to see it bend and let's
glad you mentioned that trend. Like that's one of the things that like really just makes me mad when I read a book. I have DNF so many books just because they like, oh, we're gonna use rape as a like character motivation, and I'm just like, nope, I'm not dealing with this anymore.
There was a real big issue with it in comic books, called Women in Refrigerators.
Yep. Not limited to comic books.
But the term "women in refrigerators" that's where it came from, because Green Lantern's girlfriend was murdered and stuffed in a fridge, and as character development for him to do something. And it wasn't the only one. Obviously, it's happened in books and in film and in TV and in
All the time, yeah.
Look, honestly, one of the reasons I DNF'd The Witcher, I couldn't get through it. But in the first episode, there was a scene where there was just like topless women in the background. And like, obviously that wasn't violent, but at the same time, like, women aren't wallpaper. Why are you using this as set dressing? Like, these are people. I don't know. It's the actress's choice, and I know it doesn't bother a lot of people, but it did bother me.
The first season
Definitely
of
bothers.
the first 2 seasons of Game of Thrones was saying much the same way. They were just having like women in set dressing, like, oh, we're going to a brothel, and they like one of the like directors called it sex position.
Yeah.
And I was like, wow, okay. No.
But to be fair to them, they also had a lot of naked men as well. But I mean, they did have. I mean,
I'm not sure that makes it better. I don't want to objectify a man any more than I want to be objectified.
No,
Exactly.
Sorry.
Again, I know there are.
Just to
Bridging
take
is
it a little
better
bit to
anyway.
Destin's point, and with regards to the sex position, it's actually true because what the HBO people did, they actually invented scenes where characters would talk about their plans or future, and invariably there would be some sort of sex going on, which wasn't there in the books. And that's why the term sex position came in. And it just became worse and worse in the future seasons. Like I remember there's this one really horrific scene going on in the Northern Wilds, and there is some brutalizing going on in the background, and there are people talking, and I was like, why? And Game of Thrones lost me a lot, not just because of the way they handled the last 2 seasons, but just overall, I don't know why they were writing it or why they were doing it that way, but there was just something really wrong. So thank you, Suzannah, for bringing that up. That's a very vital point. Grimdark can be written, but it doesn't necessarily need to focus on the degradation of women. And of course, you know, nobody's saying that you can't write if you want to. You can, but you got to do the research for it, and you got to, present it in such a way that it doesn't re-traumatize people again. And of course, there's always the option of trigger warnings that people know about it in advance. That way, if they choose to, they can choose not to read it as well.
And for me, fridging
Thank you
goes
so much
well,
for that. Now,
well
sorry,
beyond.
go on. I didn't mean to interrupt.
For me, fridging goes well beyond rape and killing, because very often you would see a female character, simply use as a device for the male character to advance, their storyline, to advance their character development. I mean, we should definitely have less of that.
Yeah.
As a Bollywood movie watcher, I can't tell you how much from the 90s and 80s we had this trope and we didn't even know what it was called, because in almost every 70s, 80s, and 90s, even up to the 2000s hot Bollywood movies, we had the hero had to be motivated because his female partner or the heroine was in danger, or was her modesty was assaulted, or something of that sort. And it was just a common thing. And now that you look back upon it, you're like, this was horrendous, and nobody even said a word about it.
Like, it's okay that you want to, like, if your character one of your characters happen to die, like in a couple, but that shouldn't be the only motivation. Like, I have a similar thing that happens where, like, my character loses his wife in the 3rd book, but like, she already foresaw this, and she already had plans in case this happened. So she's like, she's still a motivating force in the book, even after her death. And even the characters like, even dead, she's amazing. Like, and I'm like, I want to have that, keep that into the thing. Like, she had her own plans. She knows what's going on. Like, and I'm like,
Yeah.
And
I do something similar in one of my books.
Yeah.
If you have to kill the wife, then I'm definitely interested in the wife. I'm interested in, what was she all about? Dreams, hopes, what happened to her? And yeah.
Yeah, just don't be killing people off in the 1st book. Like, apparently that happened in like Wheel of Time in a new series. It's like, oh, we introduced this character's wife. Oh, she's dead now. And I'm like,
exactly. That is the very first episode, man. He just kills her. Oh my gosh! And the problem with this is they kind of explore this, but he doesn't even show a lot of emotion about it. Like, he's okay, I killed her, man. Okay, well, that's bad.
if I'm not wrong, that wife character was not even there in the books, right? That's
Yeah,
completely made up.
they made her up just to die. Like that's what it was. It's like let's make this character. She's motivation now. Like no.
See, stuff like this puts me in a quandary because as a science fiction and fantasy reader, I want to see more fantasy shows and more fantasy stuff on TV. So I want to support them. But then they do, like, there's stuff like this. Like, Game of Thrones was this massive hit while really doing some really hard things and ending in a really horrible way. Even Wheel of Time, I watched the entire first season. Again, I'm not a fan of, I gave up on book 7 because it was too long and too much braid tugging for me. So I didn't really care much for it. I watched the first season. I have read the books a long time ago, so I thought it was okay. But I do remember this whole thing, like, the wife character, literally even in the first 30 minutes of the episode, they killed her. And then I read later on that she wasn't there even there in the books. Like, why? But I'm now in a, like, what do you all think? Like, is there, like, you want to support these shows because you want more stuff to come down the pipeline? There's so many books, so many good series out there which deserves to be made. But I feel like if you don't support these shows, the Hollywood producers are just go like, nobody watches them. Let's just go on making track stuff.
Well, from my perspective, like, the only prestige fantasy show that I've been interested in and that I have really super enjoyed so far has been Shadow and Bone. And I feel like, I don't have to watch the other things if I don't want to watch them. Because people already, the executives already know that there's money in fantasy.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
They have a few hits. There's no holding them back. They will make fantasy shows. And so I feel like I have the ability to just pick and choose what I want to see, and I don't. Yeah.
Netflix has a lot of good shows that are South Korean. That are fantasy.
Oh.
Uncanny Countess, Sweet Home, Hotel de Luna, and there's loads of it. And they do a really, really good job with their fantasy stuff. And you can also go into like anime, and some of the anime, like Arcane, did fantastically. Was a brilliant show. I've recently started watching the Dragon's Blood, DOTA Dragon's Blood. That's perfectly decent.
Avatar: The Last Airbender, huge.
Avatar: The Last Airbender, one of the greatest shows of all time.
Just finished rewatching it with a young friend.
Yeah, and then in a couple of weeks there's Vox Machina, which comes out on Amazon. So there's plenty of really good fantasy stuff out there. It's just that some of it gets a bit more press than some of the other stuff for various reasons, for the stars and how much they spend or whatever. But yeah, there's still very, very good stuff out there, without having to always dive into the same few big things.
All right. Well, thank you all. Now, one of the common theme that I have kind of gathered from you all is that, everybody kind of feels, rightly so, considering where we are in the real world, that, we want to move away from the super grim dark stuff, and we kind of want to move towards a little bit more hope-based fantasy, or noble pride fantasy, as the term I have read online as well. With that being said, what do you anticipate, will the indie world, the self-published world we'll be writing about next versus, what this traditional published world will be wanting to publish out next? Do you think it'll be more, like you all mentioned, shorter books, smaller books, maybe more standalone books? Because fantasy definitely, it would be good to have a few standalones here and there. What do you all think? And I would love to open it to anybody who wants to talk first.
I think the indie world does lots of it anyway. It's just like everything. How do you notice it? How does it come to the top, and how do people discover it? I mean, that's the truth for everybody, whether they're indie or traditional published to a good degree. But I'm both. Steve's both. It's that struggle to be noticed. But I think that lots of indie books push those barriers and those boundaries anyway. They're out there. If we look hard enough, and if they make a name for themselves and people pick them up. Spiffbo is a great way of, for people to do that, to get seen. So yeah, I think it's out there. We just need to look for it.
Well, from my perspective, as someone who writes with a bit of a foot in both worlds, like, I have my more grimdark, gritty stuff, and I have my more upbeat, comedic stuff. Okay, and it's the upbeat, comedic stuff that has been the big success. I've got I've got like a gas lamp fantasy set in the 1890s where all the rulers of Europe, all the royal houses of Europe are different sorts of monster, and the main character is she's got werewolf scars on her face, and it marks her as an outcast, and she's got a anyway. It was a lot of fun. I made a lot of really dumb jokes in those books. And they sell like bananas. It's fantastic. But when I was, if I'm going to be totally honest, and I hope this doesn't come across as biting the hand that feeds me, because I was a Spiffbo finalist and I love Spiffbo and I think it's absolutely fantastic. Everybody involved, all the judges do such amazing work. Super, super grateful. But they do have, there are definite biases involved, and you can tell that from at the start of the year. There's a survey that someone usually does of the judges' tastes, and when you look at that survey, you can see that the tastes skew very much in a certain direction, like huge preference for middle-aged male protagonists, huge biases away from female-led subgenres like young adult, urban fantasy, and romantic fantasy, which means that while Spiffbo, Spiffbo being fantastic the way it is, also has room to grow towards a more inclusive judging pool, which is able to appreciate the critical, the things in sort of more lighter, comedic, romantic, comforting fantasy. And yeah, I would like to see more recognition of that on the critical side of things. Now, I feel like that's like just asking for the moon, because it's so difficult in other genres of indie publishing to get any critical like attention at all. The fact that we have Spiffbo for fantasy and get actual real fantasy, real critical attention on indie fantasy is so brilliant. But I would love to see the kind of book that could make it to the finals becoming a bit more inclusive of that more funny or lighthearted or noble bright fantasy. I don't know if that makes sense, but I do think that after 2 years of COVID and all the other nonsense that's going on in the world, people are going to opt for more upbeat stories. So hopefully it will happen anyway.
Absolutely.
Speaking of that, like my fantasy book Tavern didn't make it past the first round in the Spiffbo, and mainly because everyone like, oh, there's not a lot of like hard conflict in the beginning, and I was like, just because I present the world as a lighter fantasy doesn't mean that sad things doesn't happen in my world. I think that people forget that. Like, you can have sad things happen in noble bright fantasy. There's a whole huge thing that happens in the middle of my book that like shook people to its core. And it's like, and people didn't, and like the judges didn't get to that point. They just assumed that like everything was going to be happy and joyous and fluffy the whole time. And I'm like, no, I'm writing a character who's built around being anxious. There's going to be something bad that's going to happen to him. I'm just setting this up. Like, and like, I feel like I do understand the whole 10% thing with Spiffbo. That like, oh, they got to read 10% of the book. They don't like it. They don't like it. But like, there's certain parts of fantasy that you have to build up to. And I don't think that like a lot of them give it enough chance. They already decide, they get idea in their head, and like one of the judges from a different blog read my book, right, and she absolutely loved it. And she like, if you were in my blog, if your book was in my like judging pool, you would have made it to the finals. And like somehow they'll both encourage me and hurt me at the same time. So I do think that like it's a large amount of taste there. So
there is a lot of taste involved. Yeah, and again, I totally don't want to complain at all about it because it's fantastic,
amazing.
and I'm
amazing contest. I give anyone to do it to try. At least
brilliant. But if there was one thing on my wish list, it would be like, that.
Yeah. I'm not a serious defender because both Mihir and I have been judges for it. I think I stepped out 2 years ago after doing 6 years of it or so, and I had a book in the first one I didn't get through. So yeah, there is, of course, there's taste in it. There's taste in all those things, and it's a commitment for everyone to do it, including the authors, obviously. So send their books up to people to read because it's so hard to get people to read indie books. When I started out, I can't remember.
Yeah, so
10 years ago, you couldn't get a review anyway. You couldn't even send it to a blog. The first thing they said was no English. All right.
Yeah, so I guess the challenge is, how does your more lighthearted, noble, bright fantasy rise to the top if it's not getting critical attention? And maybe I specifically wrote my lighthearted fantasy to appeal to the market and to sell well, and it did, thankfully. But what about the people who can't find that particular intersection of what they want to read and what the market wants to buy? Like, how does their lighthearted fantasy rise to the top? So,
to answer the question about what I think, if I think that indie is going to start going all lighthearted, no, I don't at all think that. I have my main series is published traditionally, and those are action-packed, violent adventures with lots of silliness and characters who swear a lot, and horrible things happen to horrible people, and horrible things happen to good people. And they sell very, very well. And anything that sells very, very well is always going to be popular. And Grimdark sells very, 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 very well.
Well, yeah, it does.
And it ain't going anywhere. And I guarantee you that in 2023, the biggest fantasy books of the top 10, at least a few of them are still going to be Grimdark. However much certain some certain publishers or agents or whatever might want more joyful books, that doesn't mean people are going to buy more joyful books. People like dark stuff. That's why Mihir was selling millions of books. People enjoy that. People enjoy characters who are broken, horrible people doing horrible things and then having comeuppance for those horrible things. That's a huge
because it's tension, right? There's a lot of tension in that. There's a lot of tension in that.
Yeah, if you're living in a country and the people in charge of your country are absolute morons and they are horrible people, and you're reading fantasy where there's a bunch of people in charge who are morons and they are horrible people and they have their comeuppance, that is incredibly cathartic,
satisfying,
and people want that. People want to read that bad things happen to bad people. And I know Grimdark is a bit different because Grimdark has bad things happen to good people. But the bad things happen to good people, and then that spurs them on to do whatever they need to do for the bad people. And I know the good people that always win. Grimdark's a bit more complicated than that. Not always quite cut and dry. But I don't think that necessarily means that people are going to start moving from Grimdark to joy, to the brighter, joy, more joyful. And then, again, like Deston said, you can have this joyful, more funny, more light-hearted books, and some horrible stuff can happen in them. Terry Pratchett's books are incredibly light-hearted, and horrible things happen to people in these books. People are murdered. People have their lives taken away from them, all at the whim of some dice roll of someone who no one else can see, and yet it's still, the good guys generally kind of win and the bad guys generally kind of lose. And I think that's what, even the one that I'm thinking of off the top of my head is oh god, no, now I can't remember what it's bloody called. It's the one where wait a minute, I'm going to think what it's called. It's not First Law. It's First Law, Abercrombie. It's the other Joe Abercrombie book with the sister.
Best Out Cold.
She's horrible. She's a terrible, horrible human being. and horrible things happen to her. So she delivers increasingly horrible things to the terrible, horrible human beings who did horrible things to her. That's pretty much what grimdark is. And I think it's always going to be here, and it's always been here. It's just now got a label.
Yeah, no, I don't expect it to go away at all. I'd just like to see more recognition of the artistic merits of.
Yeah, I agree.
I
think there will be more joy bright, or whatever you want to call it. I think there will be more high fantasy as well. I think there'll be more of all of this kind of stuff, more comedic fantasy, more because right now we're in the middle of a pandemic and people are writing their hearts out to try and cope with it. And I think you'll start to see more and more and more of those books trickle out over the coming years. But yeah, I still think that grimdark's going to be. I mean, it's kind of where it's gone, fantasy-wise, and I don't think it's going away. But that doesn't necessarily mean that all grimdark is grimdark either. Some things get labelled grimdark, and they're not really. They're just fantasy where horrible things happen.
It's fantasy where horrible things happen, Steve.
Yeah, but that's the same with all fantasy. Or horrible things happen in all fantasy. Or horrible things happen in all science fiction. Or you don't get grimdark science fiction. And Ian Banks's science fiction can be fairly grimdarky, but no one.
Oh, Ian Banks is pretty dark. It's pretty dark.
Yeah,
but it's all about tension, right?
Yeah,
it's all about tension, because if you even in grimdark, this is what you said is very true, Steve, that grimdark doesn't deliver the retribution aspect, right? So it's horrible things happen and they keep happening, and then it's over. But I mean, it's mostly the tension, because you expect, even though retribution won't come, you kind of expect it, and this expectance of the payoff keeps you going through the end. And this is why, I mean, like Game of Thrones is also built this way, right? So every time somebody, fan asks for something, George Martin kills a Stark. But all of this killing, it kind of prepares you for the great retribution. So that some of the remaining Starks, they will rise up and murder everybody, just cut through everybody, and that's where you want your readers to be. You want them kind of expecting that, being tense on the edge of their seat, oh shit, no, it's not yet, but it will come. So yeah, of course it will exist always.
You just have to stick the landing.
Yeah, of course.
If you don't stick the landing, you're completely done, and that's that. If your landing of your grimdark, or any book really, isn't satisfying, then it won't work. Which is why you build that tension and build it and build it and build it and build it and build it. If you then go, and then they just shook hands.
No, exactly.
What? No. And I'm not saying that in a mocking term for anything that isn't grimdark. I just mean that there has to be a proportionate level of ending for whatever tension you've put your characters through for 500 pages.
Slightly spoilery for Game of Thrones, but that's kind of what bothered me about Cersei's ending. It's like, oh, she did all these horrible things. That's oh my god, a building fell on her. Yeah.
Yeah, that's why those last episodes don't work, because the tension that they built up was never released in a satisfying way. It was just, and they all sat down and spoke about it.
I will mention also that there are different sorts of tension. So there's romantic tension, and then there's the kind of tension that you'll find, for example, in A Fantasy of Manners, where, I don't know if you've read much Sylvia Moreno Garcia, but she's got A Fantasy of Manners that, and so sometimes the stakes aren't so huge that you need huge payoff. Another example, Quinby Olson's book, Miss Percy's Pocket Guide to the Care and Feeding of British Dragons, or something like that. It's about a middle-aged spinster who winds up with a baby dragon. There doesn't need to be a huge cathartic payoff to make that a really fun book.
But whatever the tension you pick, the payoff has to suit whatever tension you pick.
Yeah,
definitely.
Yeah.
And just to put a fine point on this conversation, in George R. R. Martin's case, the show didn't pan off and the books aren't here, so we're just all left wondering when it'll come and what will happen.
The show won't stick the landing in the worst possible way. They will just won't come out. I mean, this is just, it will just, he won't. I mean, I hope he will. I hope he will write them. And somebody in the chat actually said that he should probably publish them posthumously because the expectations are so high, he's never going to deliver.
Actually, I read this that he's supposedly written it into his will that if he, unfortunately, for any reason passes away, nobody can finish the series. They're going to
Don't
burn
let
all
Brandon Sanderson do that.
No, they're going to burn his notes. He is very possessive about his world. He's very anti-fan fiction as well. So he considers anybody writing in his world fan fiction, and George R. R. Martin is severely against it, which of course is his viewpoint, as is his case. But I just find him.
Pratchett did as well, wasn't it? He had that written in. All his hard drives were driven over.
It depends. Some authors I know are a little bit. They're like, okay, so long as you don't tell me about it, you can do what you want. Fan fiction is okay. And some authors I know are like, just no. So, anyways, all right. Well, I think we're coming close to this wonderful talk session. So here's what I would love for you all to plug in. Can you all tell us what are you working on currently, or what you're publishing next? And I'm going to pick somebody whom I haven't picked on so far. So, Deston, how about you, sir?
I'd be happy to start. I'm publishing Dust Ocean Blues, the second of my science fiction books this year, and I'm working on the third. I've also got the third book of my fantasy book already finished. That's going through editors, called Undergrove. But kind of picks up where Tavern left off, because Duke's Brand is kind of like the middle ground. It's like Tavern, Duke's Brand, which is kind of like the middle that takes a new protagonist, and we go back to the previous protagonist on Undergrove. And I'm currently working on Dust Country Blues, which is kind of like it's the end of a trilogy, and I'm kind of gonna miss it. But I still have a lot of fun things that I've introduced in this one, like Texas speaking like Cthulhu, for example. So that's basically it. That's my plan this year, and I hope that y'all come by and see what I got planned.
Definitely.
Well, thank you for sharing that, Deston. Jeff, you want to go next, sir?
I will go next. So at the moment, obviously, because I'll plug mine's out in hardback at the moment. Roman history in this one. Older protagonist who's getting ready to retire, a general. Not a farm boy at all. So yeah, that comes out in paperback in March in all good bookshops and reputable stores. After
great.
that, thank you. The second one's written. Is with my agent at the moment. Third one, we talked about before the show with David. I wrote 100,000 words last year on the third one. Wrote the book twice, chucked it, started again. So that's my synopsis is done for that one, and I've started writing a completely different book, which is probably not. It's a bit darker than that one. So I'm still writing some dark stories for that one, but that's going to take a while to finish. So that's where I'm at the moment. If that made any sense in that ramble at 11:30 at night.
Well, it did. Thank you for that. And I'm actually hoping to meet you because I have the hardback cover as well. I'm hoping to get it signed and personalized by you if I do get to meet you at BristolCon later this year.
I look forward to it. Do that.
Thank you. It's been 2 years of disappointments of me wanting to go and it being cancelled and all of that stuff. So fingers crossed.
We'll make you welcome.
Suzannah, do you want to go next?
Sure. So what I'm working on at the moment, I'm actually taking a month off. I'll go back to work next week. I really need this time to refill the creative well, but I did publish a book this month. It was A Conspiracy of Prophets, which is the fourth book in my Watchers of Outremer series and the direct sequel to my Spiffbo finalist, A Win from the Wilderness. So that was a lot of fun. People said it was like getting punched in the face a lot. So,
I love those.
Yeah, so that's the sort of grittier series that I've got on the go. And then as soon as I get back to work, I'll be digging into one of my Gaslamp books. I'm writing a spin-off series to the trilogy that I published last year. And it's basically leverage with ghosts and monsters. So lots of heists and a former vampire who still hasn't gotten out of the habit of tearing people's throats out with his teeth. So we'll see.
Okay, what's this? Sorry, excuse me for this. Is this the follow-up series to that trilogy? Was it set around the Jack the Ripper era or something, like Victorian era, if I'm not wrong? 'Cause I
Yes,
saw
so
you
the
tweet about
original
it.
series was a trilogy, Miss Sharp's Monsters, and this one is going to be a somewhat longer series called Miss Dark's Apparition. So
Awesome. Well, looking forward to that. Thank you, Suzannah. Steve, you want to go next, sir?
Yeah, okay. I am currently writing the second book in a new series. I'm contracted for a new 3-book series called Riftborn. And the first book's already done and getting edited at the moment, and the second book's being written, and I have to finish the third book as well this year. So I might be sleeping some other time. And then I also have to write. I wrote Black Coat last year, which was my science fiction book, which people keep asking me for a sequel for. So I guess I should probably write that too. And then whatever else I feel like writing, because something will come up and I'll think, oh, that's a good idea, and then I'll write it. That seems to be how my brain works.
Perfect. Well, thank you, Steve. And Yaroslav, do you want to finish this off, sir?
Sure. I wanted first of all to say that when Suzannah said that she would love, to have more books to be used as blunt weapons, what you don't know is that she won't. I think she wants to use them for like there are giant huntsman spiders in Australia. Leg span.
there's one in here somewhere. I haven't seen it for a couple of days, but I'm pretty sure it's still in here.
But it's a giant one, like 30 centimeters leg span, right?
About that
Oh.
wide across.
Oh.
My gosh. Yeah.
Nope.
I mean, they're like pets, but huge, man. I mean, I am arachnophobic. That's a horrible dream for me. But what I've been working on. First of all, are there any Russians in the chat? Maybe there are some Russians in the chat. But for them, Exmo, the biggest Russian traditional publisher, is putting out a book of mine which has Tower of Munden Straw, the Nebula finalist from last year, but it's an expanded edition. So when we published in Tower of Munden Straw, the magazine, which was serializing it, cut a lot of scenes for brevity, to fit it into the issues. And for the Russian edition, we've reinstated all those scenes, so it's an expanded edition. Plus, there are all of my short stories, which I've published all over the years, and some of my favorite non-published stories. So I'm really hyped for the book. Let's see how it turns out. And I've been working on a novel into which I've expanded the novella, Tower of Munden Straw, again. And expansion is in this case, it's about having a second part, having the narrative completed, rounded up, all the themes closed. And it's an interesting thing, because at the end of Tower, almost all of the characters can be dead.
Mm-hmm.
So some of them definitely are, some of them are not. I'm not telling who are dead and who are alive, but the second part answered that. And I also did a few questionnaires on Twitter to see what people think, and the answers surprised me. So I think the second part will surprise some people. Anyway, I don't know when this will come out, because I'm currently working on the notes which my agent gave me. Let's see how it pans out.
All right, awesome. I can tell you, Lucas, my fellow blogger at FBC, he definitely loved it. So he's going to be excited to hear this, and he'll definitely want to know more. So I'm sure he'll email you about it.
Thank you so much.
All
Lucas
right.
is wonderful.
Yes, he is. He keeps the blog alive. All right. Well, I want to extend a thank you to all 5 of you for taking up the time today. I know it's midnight for most of you. Suzannah, it's already in the future. So thank you to you as well, so early in the morning. Thank you so much for answering all the questions and for helping elicit all these excellent opinions. And again, thanks to David Walters and the Fanfi Attic crew for hosting this. We would love to see you all next year as well. And I hope you can look forward to day 5, which is tomorrow, with some exciting panels that are coming through. So thank you, everybody. And
Thank you for moderating.
Thank you.
It was a wonderful moderation, Mihir.
Yes.
Well,
Thank you so much.